Chapter 1, the evolution of law enforcement. So when we look at the learning objectives, one, explain when and why law enforcement began, understand the significant contributions of Sir Robert Peel made to law enforcement, identify when and where the first modern American police forces began and what for, list the levels of law enforcement, list the levels of government authorized to have law enforcement agencies, identify what additional forms of law enforcement operates in the United States, identify who the chief law enforcement officer at the federal level is, compare and contrast the main characteristics of the three traditional eras of policing, and note the time frame during which each existed. Name the fourth era of policing that has emerged and identify the impetus behind it. So when we look at the heritage of law enforcement is a source of pride. Law enforcement is a body of rules for human conduct enforced by imposing penalties for their violation. Laws are made and passed by the legislative branch. Laws are based on customs, traditions, mores, and current need. So law enforcement goes back. Goes back until like 2000 BC. When you think of it as early form, when primitive people tried to figure out how to deal with their problems in the neighborhood, in their communities, somebody did something bad, then they would do something bad to them, and it was just one of those kind of things. You just try to figure out how to live and how to get people to condone. So these things go way back. It's when we think in terms of law enforcement. So if we look at primitive and ancient law, customs and social order. So when we think about Babylon, the code of Hammurabi, Hammurabi. This is something when you look at it. This is when they established. Basically, this is where the concept of an eye for an eye comes from. You do something wrong. This is where it said we're going to do something to you because you did something wrong. So again, the term, the phrase "eye for an eye." This is where it started in ancient Babylon. For those who do things wrong, we're going to do something to you because you did it. And when you look at ancient Egypt, these guys, they came up with what we refer to today as the first court systems, where they actually set up some courts and stuff where people could come in and be heard, and you would be have like a judge over your case to hear what was going on. But that started in Egypt. China developed in ancient China. They had developed a court system too, but they took it a step farther. They had like civil and criminal, and they were also set up multiple jurisdictions in China. When we think of Greece, who was started the early forms of democracy, when you look at it, starts there. But they also did something else too. Every year they would elect 5 individuals from the communities who basically had unlimited power to check on the Senate, the courts, whatever else, to make sure that things were being done fair and equitable. Rome was one of the things that stands out for me about Rome is Rome was one of the first places where they actually said, hey, we're going to use the military to do some of the things that we think should law enforcement type stuff. And I'll give you an example of one big thing that they did is they brought in members of the military to provide guards for the palaces. And that was something that was really not big and not done prior to them actually doing it in Rome. So which legal customers do we find that you find most interesting and why? I can tell you the ones that stands out in my mind is going back to ancient Babylon when the eye for an eye started. That's when they realized, kind of primitive, ancient times and kind of primitive, but even they realized that we have to do something to suppress or try to stop this crime. And most importantly, deal with people accordingly, do something to them when they do it. An eye for an eye. And so you think about it today, somebody does something bad, then we, the citizens, the court, the judicial system, the police, in terms, what do? We do something to them. They rob somebody, they get arrested, they get prosecuted, an eye for an eye. So when we look at the milestones, we look at the Anglo-Saxons and the tithing system that they put into place. It's basically what they did is set up little in communities. They set up, had people in the community who were responsible for basically dealing with people who did bad stuff. So in every little village, you had somebody, somebody or somebody's, excuse me, somebody's that was responsible for dealing with the people who did bad things. So in essence, it was the community holding the community accountable. And in each one of those instances and stuff, these were always dealing with people that they knew who were actually, who were kind of like the chiefs, and then also the wrongdoers, but everybody knew everybody. The Norman Frank pledge system, when we think about that, this goes back to William the Conqueror. And I'm not sure off the top of my head what year, but I'm going to say it's somewhere around 1060 or 65, 66, somewhere in there. When William the Conqueror came in and took over England, one of the things that he did is to ensure that he had stability, a national stability. He didn't trust the system of tithing that the Anglo-Saxons had and stuff, and he didn't want to leave that in place. So what he did is he established 55 military districts to be over them. And these were people that he put in place that had loyalty to him, that could keep the Anglo-Saxons and stuff in line. And over each one of those districts, they appointed a person they refer to as a sheriff. And listen to what I said, sheriff. That's modern day translation to sheriff. And that's where that started with the Norman Frank pledge system. When we think about the 12th century was very important in England because one of the things we found out then is they actually said, hey, we need to come up with a way all crimes are not equal. So we need to come up with something, to kind of distinguish the difference between these crimes. So what did they come up with? Felonies and misdemeanors. Felonies for major crimes, misdemeanors for minor crimes, which we still have today. Now, this is probably the most interesting thing on here, the Magna Carta. And it was King Henry I or King Henry II, I'm not sure, but the people felt like they weren't being treated properly. They was being taxed without representation. They didn't have a say so. They felt like the king didn't have their best interest at heart, and they felt like that they were basically deprived of basic human rights and stuff. And so when they went to the king a couple of times and asked him, could he do better by them and stuff, they did it at least on 2 occasions, and the king was like, forget y'all. No, I'm good. So they went back and they sat down and they wrote the Magna Carta. And it was basically a list of demands of things that the king must do to be fair and equal to folks and treat people right, and without taxation, without representation, make sure people were not unfairly judged or accused or kicked out of the country or whatever else. And then they formed basically a group, almost like a little army, and they forced the king to sign it. So from that right there, you look at that and you start thinking about things like modern present Bill of Rights, Constitution, things like that. That Magna Carta is where it started back in England. And so when we look at the next 500 years from that period on, it's amazing how things, if you look through history and you see how things are tracking as far as law enforcement and communities and judicial system, you will see things and hear things that we hear and see today, because the origin of them, that's where they came from. Why wouldn't the hue and cry work in the current criminal justice system of the United States? So when we think about this is the system that they had in England. And one of the reasons that when you think in terms of how our societies have evolved, you have modern technology and all those other things, it kind of makes it difficult for an antiquated system of law enforcement and criminal justice to work in present day. It just wouldn't work for so many different reasons. But our origins goes back to that. And this hue and cry goes back to what was happening in England. Now, this gentleman right here is considered the father of modern policing. So Sir Robert Peel, back in 1829, he was appointed to run the London Metropolitan Police. And they had a lot of issues. London had gotten extremely large. A lot of people had moved from the countries to the cities, trying to get jobs to make ends meet. You had immigrants coming in. So they were growing. Well, when the cities grow and you get a lot of people in there, what happens? Things start to happen, and crime started to spike. So when the London Metropolitan Police in 1929 appointed Sir Robert Peel, he went in and he revamped the police department. One of the things he did that you look around today and stuff, they changed their uniforms and stuff. They went from being red to blue. Red looked too much like the military, the red coats. So they wanted to make it easier, and they wanted to be accepted by people. Basically, we have to police the people, but we have to have their respect to do it. So they changed that. And some other things they did is they actually, when you look at it, they started something that is extremely important. They started the first foot patrols in communities. Having police called beats, having police officers walk the beat in the community. And the philosophy was, well, if you're out in the community walking around on a beat, you get to know everybody there. Everybody gets to know you. You get to respond to things because you're already out there in that community on that beat. And they even broke it down to the point like that on that beat, you're supposed to be passing a landmark about every 15 minutes. You were constantly walking and responding to things. And subsequently, crime went down, and this was very successful. And as a result, focused on crime prevention through the foot patrols, that's what they were doing. Because their presence out there meant there were certain people, criminals, that wouldn't do things because they knew the police were there. So it became a deterrent. But this is this blueprint that he established in 1829 was the blueprint that established pretty much how most law enforcement agencies, particularly in the U.S., how we work today. And from the first U.S. police forces and stuff, they were in major metropolitan areas. You look at New York, Boston, and L.A. And when all of these departments set up, they all set up utilizing stuff that was from 1829 Peel. Now, some of these agencies did run into some problems because one of the things that Peel put a lot of emphasis on when they hired people back in 1829 in England was London. It was moral character. It was like if don't hire people with low moral character. If you do, these are people who are subject to not follow the rules and also to get involved in unsavory things as while they're carrying the badge. With some of these agencies right here, with these departments right here, they didn't do that. They copied the blueprint to actually how to set it up, but they didn't follow that philosophy. And as a result, all three of them had a period where they had a lot of corruption in their police departments. So from this also, we had the evolution of police investigators and detectives. Remember I talked about the beat officers. Now we've got police officers, investigators, and detectives to go out and investigate crimes, severe crimes and things when they happen. When you look back in history, you have slave patrols. Slave patrols were a group of people usually hired by slave owners to catch runaway slaves. So there were certain tactics and things that they used that actually came from the field of law enforcement and military to actually track slaves down. The evolution of city police. When look at these major metropolitan police departments up to Boston, New York, and Los Angeles, one of the things you found is when you had the evolution of the city police, it had to function differently. It had to because they were dealing with much larger populations. Vigilante movement. This came about as well. This is where basically said communities, and this goes way back in history, not just modern day, but this goes way back before you actually had organized police departments and stuff. In some places, how they dealt with criminals, it was vigilante, basically the community. And usually when they caught people doing things, the punishment was very severe. A lot of times the punishment didn't fit the crime. For instance, if somebody stole 2 eggs from a chicken, vigilante movement stuff, they may say, well, we're going to cut off that hand. So as we move forward to more modern day, we see the demands has to be met with the United States and how it's grown. And so what happened is on the federal level, we started having departments. So make sure you understand, on the federal level, you have departments, and under the departments, you have agencies. So you look at, here's some of the major departments right here. Department of Justice, Department of Treasury. Now, there's one that's not up there. It's Department of Homeland Security, and this, which is really big. The Department of Justice has multiple agencies up under it. Department of Treasury does too. You have other federal law enforcement agencies and stuff. You have like U.S. Postal Inspectors, Coast Guard, that's under Homeland Security. Military Police, that's under the Department of Defense. But they all have roots in what transpired back in 1829 to what Sir Robert Peel did back in England. There are things that he established back then that these federal agencies, these law enforcement agencies still do to this day. So establishment of federal agencies continues stuff. So I won't try to go all through these myself. You can pause and you can take a look at this and you can see what I'm talking about. What you will see is you'll see the department, and then you'll see under the department, you'll see different agencies. And this is the organizational chart right here, by the way. So in the states, in the United States of America, we have 50 states. So when we look at the states, we have state bureaus of investigation and apprehension. These are usually your highest branches of law enforcement in the state. Every state they all have different names. In North Carolina, it's the State Bureau of Investigation. In Georgia, it's the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. So these guys, and a lot of their law enforcement people are referred to as special agents, just like on the federal level. You have state fire marshal divisions, and these are the highest ranking fire marshal investigators in the area appointed by the state. Now, on local levels, you have fire chiefs and stuff, but the fire marshal is a state agency. So that's a level above. So you have different departments of natural resources, and then agencies up under that. You have driver and vehicle service department. In North Carolina, they refer to as the DMV. You have Department of Human Rights. So what you have at the federal level, a lot of that has been mirrored on the state level. Main county agencies, the county sheriff, usually elected. State law establishes powers and duties. So when you look at the sheriff, and remember I told you the origin, it was sheriff that came back from England back in the day. So those are people who are elected. They serve a term and then they go up for re-election. So they're voted in by the people. A lot of times when you find people who are anti-government and don't believe in the government or recognize the government, the only law enforcement officer that we will recognize will be the sheriff, because the sheriff was voted in, not somebody that was hired and put in by bureaucrats. You have county police, and it's similar to city police, but they operate outside the incorporated areas. So they would be operated in the county areas versus in the city, where you may have the city police. And this is how they set up their jurisdictions, and so that you don't have competing interests. And you do find times and stuff where they do have to work together, because they may have somebody who's committing crimes both in the county and in the city, in incorporated city. You have coroner and medical examiners as well. These are agencies that are very tied close to law enforcement by virtue of crimes, particularly when you talk about homicides and things along those lines. And these people are elected as well. Powers and operations. So you have townships and special district police. So this is where they grant, you have township, a little small town that says, it might be a town of 2,500 people. But you know what? They say that, we're going to have a special district out here and we're going to have police. And so they hire police to come and work in their area. You have constable, you don't see that much in the U.S., but you do have some states where you have it. And this is someone where a constable will perform like minor judicial type processes. They have some law enforcement authority. They can arrest and do things along those lines. You have a local marshal who's going to be very similar. A municipal police is any any law enforcement agency in the state, in the city or the county that actually has been given its authorities by the state, city, or county. Why do we need local agencies? Why isn't society better off with one international crime force? Great discussion question. I can tell you the reason that you don't want to have that is it kills. There's no community policing. That means you don't have people who working in the community, like beat officers. Remember from 1829, beat officers working in the community. They get to know folks, and folks get to know them. Sometimes they're from that community. It does that, but also too, it's checks and balances. It's to make sure that you don't have one large law enforcement agency that gets way too strong. It's got too much power. Absolute power corrupts. And if you had something along those lines where you just had one big law enforcement agency, you would have a problem. So what's your checks and balances for that agency? So when we look at Indian country, in the U.S., we have more than 200 police departments overseen by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Nearly all such agencies respond to calls for service. Many operate one or more jails. So this is, when we look at that, this is for our Native Americans, where we have reservations. And so they operate like little cities or little counties on the reservation, because it's the sheriff or the chief of police has no authority on an Indian reservation. That is federal land. So they have their own law enforcement agencies and judicial system. Why is the Bureau of Indian Affairs necessary in the American criminal justice system? Because it takes into consideration of people. They understand the culture, they understand the norms, they understand the people, and it's like the community policing their own. People from the community policing their own. Whereas if you only had all of that being handled out here by people who don't understand their culture, don't understand their way of life, that could be very problematic, because it's like, well, why are they doing? They shouldn't be doing that. Well, that they might be a ritual or something, a custom that goes back several hundred years, but yet still. So this is where you goes back to that basic concept of community policing. People from the community policing their own. So when we look at this, we're talking about the political era. The political era. This is when you had law enforcement agencies that was primarily embedded with politicians. Now, you just think about that for a minute. You know that's going to be problematic, because whoever the politician is dictates what the law enforcement agencies would be doing. And a lot of times that could be self-serving. The reform or professional era. This is when they were trying to move away from the political era. And so they try to start to reform and try to move forward and get things more standardized and have law enforcement agencies enforcing the law and basically being accountable to the law and not a man or a political party, a person or political party. And you look at the community era, this is when community policing really kicked in. When you start looking at it and saying, you know what? If we want to try to resolve crime, prevent crime, and stop crime, we got to get to grassroots. That means we got to get into communities. You have to establish relationships within the community. The community can't fear law enforcement. They have to understand that law enforcement is not there to do things to you. Law enforcement is there to protect you. And when you have that kind of relationship, you get better results. An emerging fourth era policing, paradigm shift. So things are shifting now. And see, now what you find is you see a lot of studies shifting towards more what we refer to as intelligence-led policing. Basically utilizing data and information and analyzing it to determine what type of policing that should be done. As the information era has emerged as a result of the 9/11 attacks on the U.S. in terms of variously as Homeland Security, data-driven, intelligence-led, predictive, evidence-based policing based on risk assessment and risk management. So that's what I was just referring to. And 9/11 had a lot to do with that as well. as far as, because after 9/11, the United States created Homeland Security to try to prevent those kind of things. And intelligence-led policing is what everybody's engaging in right now as in law enforcement. That concludes chapter 1.